Everybody, I would like to welcome you to the Development Planning Sustainability Committee meeting. I am Tony Brinkatelli, Chairman of the Development Planning Sustainability Committee. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Brinkatelli.
Here.
Cleveland.
Here.
Griffin.
Here.
Harrison. Bashir Jones.
Here.
Slife.
Present.
McCormick. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. The Development Planning Sustainability Committee hearing is being held during the COVID-19 emergency declaration in accordance with Ohio's open meeting laws as amended by sub HB 197. This meeting is being held using the Zoom platform and is being live streamed on YouTube and on Cleveland's Channel 20. And also can be seen on Cleveland's Council website and from Council's Facebook page. In accordance with Ohio open meeting regulations as amended by sub HB 197, notice of this committee hearing was publicly posted. This committee hearing will be conducted as all committee hearings in accordance with council rules and Robert's Rules of Order. The chair will facilitate the meeting and call on persons to speak. If you wish to speak, please use the raise your hand option on Zoom, and please limit your comments to the matters before today's committee. As usual practice, any actions voted on during this committee will be done by voice vote, called and recorded by the committee clerk. Welcome everybody and good morning. We have one piece of legislation and we have a presentation on middle neighborhoods. So if we can do the legislation first. We have ordinance number 506/2020. An emergency ordinance authorizing the Director of City Planning to enter into an amendment to contract number PS 2019-138 with Code Studio, Inc. to extend the term of the contract up to 1 year and to add additional services for form-based zoning pilot initiative. Director Collier.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me well?
We got you.
Good morning. Yes, thank you, councilmen and members of council. This request is to, one, increase the contract amount for Code Studio, who is our form-based zoning consultant, from $225 to $254. It's an increase of about $29,000, which we have in our budget. This is being requested for a couple of reasons. One, as you all know, COVID-19 has impacted us pretty negatively with respect to process and timelines. So we want to account for some of the time lost. Many of our consultants working on various planning initiatives had to make adjustments into virtual platforms, et cetera. This is not limited to our form-based zoning consultant, and that's part of the reason why we're asking for the additional time. Also, we have a contribution that's being made by Councilman Zone of $7,000 to this process to do an expanded area. And we are also making some adjustments to the HUF engagement, which we had a conversation with Councilman Jones with respect to potential approaches for how we are going to engage given this virtual environment. The other element of this that's really important is the fact that, as you all know, we've selected 3 pilot areas in the city that include the Detroit Shoreway neighborhood, the Hub neighborhood, and the Opportunity Corridor neighborhood. So Councilman Zone, Griffin, and Councilman Bashir Jones. So we ask that you allow for this increase so that we can continue on with the work. And this lastly, we're asking for up to a year, even though we don't believe that it'll have to take that long. But we just felt that we wanted to provide ourselves appropriate cushion just because we want to make sure that we have a good amount of flexibility because we want to make sure that this is done in the correct manner. Thank you.
Thank you. So can you talk a little bit about what's been done already and a little bit more on the timeline?
Sure. So what's been done currently is Detroit Shoreway, the community engagement, some of the planning work that's a precursor to form-based zoning, the drafting of the form-based code for the target area in Detroit Shoreway. There's also been the analysis done with the Opportunity Corridor. Fortunately, with the Opportunity Corridor, much of the preliminary planning work that is required as part of form-based zoning is already done there. So that kind of put us at an advantage in the Opportunity Corridor footprint. And now there's being analysis done with respect to geography in the Huff neighborhood. After we engage in the Huff process, the actual formal drafting of the code will commence. That will consist of the 3 codes for the target areas. That would also include presentations to community members, as well as to the administration, council, planning commission, et cetera, before we get to the final adoption of the form-based code for those geographies.
If I can, I would like to read a letter I received from David Ellison. Have you received this letter, Director?
Yeah, David Ellison, we receive a lot of letters from Mr.
Okay. The letter goes on to say your agenda includes the approval and recommendation for further spending towards the creation of form-based zoning code that is intended to ultimately replace the existing zoning code. I am chair of the Cleveland chapter of American Institute of Architects Zoning Task Force, organized specifically to follow and understand the proposed zoning changes and their effect on development practices and built environment. I'm also a member of an emerging group of citizen organizations based in neighborhoods across the city of Cleveland that are being adversely affected by inappropriate development projects. While I'm not speaking for either group, I think I can say we're all very concerned about zoning legislation and the by right entitlements that will be given to developers, as well as impact on opportunities for public involvement. As representative of both groups, I wrote to Code Studio Consultants and to City Planning Department requesting that AIA and the neighborhood groups be included in the Community Advisory Board that is described in the consultant's proposal and contract. It is now our understanding that the Community Advisory Board has not been convened, nor is there any intention to convene it. Both the AIA task force and the neighborhood groups have had to find out about the consultant's activities by accident when news was posted on a website, or secondhand from attendees or exclusive development cluster meetings, despite our having requested to be more fully informed of activities. In approving more funding for the project, would you please insist that the process of revising our city zoning code be made transparent and inclusive of those who are most interested in the subject? Already zoning changes made in 2018 and 2019 have had dramatic, sometimes negative effects on development process and quality of the environment. A summary of recent pending litigation is just one indication that we should be trying to do better. We would like to lend our support to update the quality of our zoning ordinances, improving the ease and development projects of Cleveland. We can't do that if we're not included. If you want to take a quick response to that, please.
Sure, no problem. So inclusion and engagement is really the hallmark of this initiative. In Detroit Shoreway, our engagement has been extensive, and we're not doing a sort of one type of engagement approach. Every one of these areas that we're going to be engaging in is somewhat unique. We've done a unique approach into Detroit Shoreway. We did a different approach in the Opportunity Corridor area, given where we were in the process. And we're going to take a very much different tact in the Huff neighborhood. So we don't believe that you can engage in one big blanket approach because different neighborhoods are different levels of challenges and sophistication. The other thing I would respond to with respect to Mr. Ellison, this is not about AIA. This is really about really trying to update our zoning code to make projects more predictable to development interests, also make the process more efficient, and also make it more transparent. I can't tell you, and many of you have been through this, so I'm preaching to the choir with respect to the challenges that we often have to face with variances on projects that are commensurate with what we want to see happen along major corridors, et cetera. So we have to stop making these things so grossly complicated. And that's part of the reason why this form-based zoning approach is the approach that we elect to take. I've sat with a number of you, including Councilman Brincatelli, as well as Council President Kelly, at the beginning of this process, understanding that we are going to be very careful in testing this out. I remember the statement that Council President made, which I'll never forget. How do we know that this isn't the flavor of the month? And that stuck with me, So part of what we want to do here is make sure that we're intentional, we're targeted, and we can get a good handle on this before we move forward with the proposition of just revamping the city's code. So to Mr. Ellison's statement, I would say I respect his opinion, and I respect that he's a member of AIA and an individual who has a lot of time on his hands, and we appreciate any input from any resident. But our course forward has been transparent, and we intend to continue on in that direction.
Thank you. I appreciate you responding. I certainly can speak firsthand, not just on this issue, but when we talk about planning and zoning changes overall, We're blessed. We have Nicole Calhoun and Shannon Leonard who've been working with us on zoning changes with our CDCs, and it's transparent plus. The number of community meetings that they commit themselves to and engagement that they have has been pretty exemplary. And so I know that I can speak firsthand for what's going on in our community, that they've been engaged and open about it. So with that, I cannot tell if any hands are up. Is there any comments on 506-2020 to extend this contract? Okay. Having heard no additional comments, 506-2020 stands approved as read. Thank you very much, Director.
Thank you all.
Next up, we have a presentation from Jason Powers and Director Maness on middle neighborhoods. I know there's a number of people that are watching this. I've already been getting text messages. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Director Maness.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Councilman. I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then have Jason take the lead, as he's been doing the lion's share of this work on middle neighborhoods. I think that one of the first realizations I had when I started with the city now over 2.5 years ago was that the HUD dollars, which primarily our department disperses in the community, critically important for our neighborhoods and to serve the least amongst us, but really are not a good fit for our most stable neighborhoods and our neighborhoods where families choose to stay, that have generations of families that have been in our community, and that through some of the most difficult times in Cleveland have really kept the city afloat, right? They have been consistent in being able to pay property taxes and income taxes, have long since been an asset to the community, but they don't live in neighborhoods that are, as Mayor Jackson calls, often trending, sort of those hot neighborhoods. And thankfully, they often don't need the kind of interventions that HUD allows for. But the problem there is then we have this gap where we don't have tools, we don't have solutions to really help to stimulate the market in those neighborhoods. And that's become something that's been acknowledged more and more in the development community, as many of these neighborhoods that really were able to function without any kind of intervention or support have started to really need that support. And partly because of aging housing stock, aging infrastructure, the fact that you now need to do more repair in homes, you need to rebuild commercial streets. So Cleveland actually hosted a Middle Neighborhoods Conference in November of 2018, was put on by the Fed and many others in the community. And that, amongst reading a book called On the Edge, really got me thinking that this was something we really needed to look at more in Cleveland. The Cleveland Foundation supported a grant request for a 2-year study with a fellow, and Jason Powers thankfully agreed to join our team in spring of 2019. Since that time, we have seen, I think, even heightened need for the work that he's doing. The tax abatement study that hopefully we'll be briefing you on next week, and the kickoff of a 10-year housing and investment plan that the city is putting in place. These three things really go together, right? The results of the tax abatement study really heighten the need for additional tools in these neighborhoods. The tax abatement can't do it all on its own. And all of the work that Jason has done that's really brought together the fact that this is a much more complex issue, but also an issue that we can have an impact on in short order, really inviting the private marketplace into our neighborhoods, where these are neighborhoods and areas that the market really can function in with a little bit of a push. And that's what's really exciting that you'll see, is this is a very sustainable approach, because these are neighborhoods that have a lot of strength and just need a little extra support. So with that context, I want to hand it over to Jason, and we'll go through the presentation, and then Councilman Riccatelli, as you want to, it probably makes sense for Jason to go through and then take questions afterwards, just being in this platform. But I would say that if somebody has a concern or question about the data, or they're just not following, because he goes through a lot and he talks almost as fast or faster than me, I think, please interrupt.
Yeah, if you have a clarifying point, please speak up.
Okay, go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
All right, thank you, Director, and thank you, members of Council. This is a year plus in the making, and it's really a great opportunity to share with all of you what we've found. So I'll go ahead and pull this up. There's a lot of sort of baseline definitions and things that we want to start with. But as Director Maness mentioned, the middle neighborhoods work sort of nationally goes back just over the last decade and a half or so. There are some national scholars that really started to notice after the mid-2000s, right before the housing bubble burst, that there were neighborhoods throughout the cities, not just legacy cities, but really everywhere, that didn't fit the typical mold. We had our strong and invested in neighborhoods that were really starting to thrive. And then we, of course, were familiar with decades and decades of disinvestment. But there were places that perhaps in the 70s and 80s and 90s were seen as stable neighborhoods. And as a result of that, for decades, policymakers didn't necessarily see any urgent need in these places. But at the turn of the century, these places began to look a little different. And it took really sort of an underlying analysis of the actual data to see that even though the homes looked all right, the streets still had sort of echoes of just one generation prior, there was something going on that if we didn't do certain things to adjust the economics of these places, then they would have precipitous consequences in the near future. We are now, as Director Maness just mentioned, we are now at that precipice. A lot of our places that really should be that middle 15 years ago, it would have looked very strong like that, is now hitting that transition point. And the question is, which way do they go? The reader Director Maness mentioned was called On the Edge. That's really what these places are. There's a lot of cities around the country that are starting to do this work. I'm very proud to say that in Cleveland, we have some CDC leaders. We have the Cleveland Foundation sits on the steering committee, the National Steering Committee. So we have some really great representation nationally, and people are looking to us right now. So today we'll answer the first question everyone asks me, which is what is a middle neighborhood? And then the much more pressing and valuable one, what does it mean in Cleveland? Then we'll go through the bulk of the presentation is on a definitional tool. So we've been working with Case Western Reserve University for the last 7 or 8 months, developing a tool that I've already had a chance to present to the cluster and to the mayor that really we believe in CD should be able to form sort of a baseline for a lot of the other things we do when we're discussing policy initiatives and public policy interventions. Director Collier, in discussing the form-based code, mentioned that you can't take the same approach to all the different places. This is that same thing. The nice dividend is that in trying to identify middle neighborhoods, we've been able to really identify all of the places throughout the city. And then lastly, we'll touch on some public policy ramifications. So to open up, I want to also share, these are some baseline understandings that I've been working with. This is sort of basic for cities like a Cleveland, but it's something that we all need to really start with, which is that public subsidy is scarce. Our resources are scarce, and the amount of need out in our communities is obviously many times that of what we can intervene with at any given year. But the private sector really does have the ability to engage in these places in ways that are manyfold more valuable than what we can do in the city. And when I say the private sector, I'm not referring necessarily to developers, I'm talking about homeowners. And I think one of the big toolkit items is enabling home ownership in these communities where homeowners can invest, where people can buy the homes and put money into them, because the public subsidies will only start the market. And I think that's what Director Maness really is intrigued by. And we've seen this is really the middle neighborhoods idea. We need to start the motor in these places and then let the market take over, because in so many of these places it will. In distressed markets, you also need to build from strength. Cleveland has any number of distressed communities, but within those places are a lot of nodes, commercial intersections, places where if we start from those places, we can start to build. So we all know our communities, and we know that within them are a lot of different sub-communities. Identifying those places becomes really critical so that we can have the greatest impact. And above all else, we need to start with a really strong objective analysis. We're very fortunate in Cleveland to have incredible data at our fingertips with NeoCanDo, with NST, with Case Western, with our own city archives of information. we should be using that incredible resource that many other cities don't have to do analysis. And then, of course, go out to the communities, walk the streets, and really validate that what we're seeing in the data is happening on the streets before we do any kinds of investment. So what is a middle neighborhood? This is sort of the elevator pitch. So it's not distressed nor thriving. And that gets you the 30-second pitch, and most people can understand that. The problem with that definition is it really creates sort of this box, this idea that you've got distressed places, weak places, places that are taking off, and then something in the middle. And that's really not true. The reality is that thriving communities can find themselves edging toward the middle, and distressed places can be seeing the seeds of strength. And so really what's more true is that there are places in cities with declining investment. There are places in cities where the private sector has all but taken off. And then there are these transitional places between, transitions that are in some cases distressed. Some transitions are as they're growing and strengthening. Really very few places are truly stable. We want to believe in the stable neighborhood. We call our places stable. Maybe that's like people always thinking they're in the middle class. In reality, we're typically on one side or the other. And so it's really critical that when we're looking at the neighborhoods of Cleveland and getting down into the community level, that we're finding where these transitions are happening and understanding which way they're transitioning to determine what kinds of interventions are necessary. So middle means transition, middle means something in between. How do we define our neighborhoods? We've got our wards. Obviously, we can divide them up politically. We can divide them up by our CDC service areas or our SPAs for planning. When it comes to an objective analysis, we just want to get as small as we can. Like I mentioned before, the Old Brooklyn community is one neighborhood by description, but it's over a dozen census tracts and it's dozens of block groups. And when you talk to residents in the area, you'll hear them refer to the local church or the local park or school as their neighborhood. So we need to get out of the sort of broad understanding of neighborhoods and start thinking of it more as markets within our communities. So with that understanding of the middle neighborhood definition, what do they look like in Cleveland? Well, the first thing we need to recognize is that our market, of course, lives within a regional market. So people that are choosing where to live, which is obviously one segment of our population, they can choose between any number of municipalities. And because Cleveland has so many different places to live, there's really almost an offer at every price point for everyone. The Cleveland average is about $40 below the regional average. And so if you take a quick look at the price per square foot, these are 2019 data, and we use price per square foot as a way of normalizing the data so we can look at all these different places where they're building 3,400 square foot brand new homes, comparing it with a 1,200 square foot bungalow in Collinwood. We need to have some sort of way of normalizing that. So we use price per square foot, and you can see really between $100 and $150 is the range there. And economists have found that this is really a range of reinvestment. This is where we expect the market is not only functioning, but that home buyers expect and anticipate value in their home, not necessarily just appreciation, but that when you put money into the home, that you can actually see those values retained. Now, when we think about the city of Cleveland, we obviously have a handful of neighborhoods that we consider to sort of be the select neighborhoods. And what's really fascinating about it is that when you look at the data in these places, you'll see that it's head and shoulders beyond this selection of suburbs. And what this is important to recognize is that this isn't indicative of any kind of policy failure or even necessarily an issue that needs to be addressed, though it could be. What this is really showing is that there is an asset class of housing market, these luxury neighborhoods that are one of a kind in every city. This is true in Pittsburgh, in Columbus, and Baltimore. There are parts of the city where they've sort of hit it all out of the park. They're attractive to millennials and young professionals with means. They're attractive to the baby boomer generation that are looking for the urban village environment. Perhaps they're by the water, like our Battery Park. And so the values in these places, because the demand is coming from everywhere, really can go to an extraordinary levels. But if you were to, as you increase that geography, at some point the demand isn't there anymore. So we shouldn't really think of these as the top of the line for a Cleveland neighborhood, but really a regional high-end market. And then when we look at the whole sort of context, of course, Cleveland has many of the most distressed communities in the region, where home values are low enough that really what they are is they're being sold oftentimes to out-of-state investors at $25,000, $35,000 to really cash flow. They've lost their value as an actual home that you can own, and they've become long-term rentals. So when we put this into a chart, it really starts to make sense. This is the regional housing market of Northeast Ohio. And as I mentioned earlier, it stands true that we actually have something for everyone. You can find homes in just about every price range. And if you are not dedicated to living in the city of Cleveland, if it's not your civic duty, as most families and individuals don't believe, then living somewhere is all about the best opportunity for themselves or their family. When we remove the suburbs from that image, you see that the answer to the question of what are Cleveland's middle neighborhoods is that they're basically non-existent. Cleveland's middle neighborhoods really are the places that perhaps were stronger 15, 25 years ago in terms of their values, but now have really stagnated and dwindled down and been fully replaced by the first ring suburbs. And so if you look here, you can see again that horizontal bar is showing really sort of that economic replacement area where we think that homes are really, markets are stable. They're not necessarily growing massively, but they're able to increase by having homes being purchased by homeowners and invested in, and people are still keeping up with the homes. When you move just south of that is where you get to Cleveland's sort of edge neighborhoods. And so that's really what we have found. So the answer to Cleveland's middle neighborhoods is that Cleveland's middle neighborhoods, they're not middle, they're not always neighborhoods, but they're the places that are on the edge and they are threatened. They do not have the economics to self-sustain. And you can think of this, the places where the homes are simply not moving above $75,000, that no one is necessarily, or very few developers are investing in these homes to get them to fully modernized levels and then sell them because they can't sell them for a profit. This is where policy interventions like tax abatements and subsidies are necessary. But because resources are scarce, we have to find only a few places to really target these kinds of things. And so that's what we're going to get to next. How do we target them? Here we have, again, the regional housing market. And these are those edge communities that I was referring to. How do we look at this full list of places and decide where are we going to put our scarce resources? Where do we want to double down and layer our interventions? So what we did was we contracted with Case Western Reserve University and began a conversation around really defining the neighborhoods of Cleveland from a different vantage point. We can sort our neighborhoods by home value, like we just did in the previous graph. We can sort them by income. We can look for housing choice vouchers or vacancy. But there is a way to take all of these different market elements, all of these different indicators, and define through something called a cluster analysis, one index that will actually determine stronger and weaker markets on a spectrum using all of these different things. By using all of them, we don't make any one of them the premier reason why it is a stronger or weaker place, but instead we can say holistically that there are any number of things that make these particular areas more ripe for investment. When you get high enough on that level, we don't need public intervention. When you get low enough, the public intervention dollars won't go far enough. Right in the sweet spot of the emerging areas is where we think the money should be spent. So when you take those indicators and run simulations, and we are doing that right now, we have several that we've done, and the process goes like this. You run the analysis, you validate the data, and then you talk to the people on the ground and you say, does this make sense? Does this look correct? And you do that all summer long, and then you have your tool. We expect that the actual full running interactive map will be available in August, but I do have links if you're interested to some of our private data right now. So if you look at this, you can see sort of a regional market index. A through I, it's showing whether you're in South Euclid or in Collinwood, West Park, or in Fairview Park, where your areas rank based on all of these different qualities. And when you put it onto a map is really where it starts to make sense. So here is one of our generated maps that we're working with. We've got typologies A through E. And so when you think of what A through E means, it doesn't necessarily mean any higher incomes or higher home sales, though those are correlated. It's really an index that is simply showing that places are like themselves. So you can make the judgments as to whether or not higher incomes and higher home sales and lower vacancy is truly a better thing, and at what point it's maybe not just better, but now it's actually dangerously inequitable. That's for policymakers to decide, but the data shows these connections. And what I really like about showing this map is we're used to maps of the region where Cleveland is very obvious. And fair to say that Cleveland is still pretty obvious to those of us that are used to seeing it. But there are areas where you can see the line between Cleveland and its adjacent suburbs is a little bit fuzzy. And what's really interesting about that is it shows that there are places in the city of Cleveland that have markets that are very similar to the markets in the suburbs that neighbor it. So if we zoom in just a little bit, and again, this is just a demo to show what this tool can do. This is a base layer. I'll get into the parcel level data in a minute, but I'm showing the west side of Cleveland here because it's sort of the big narrative, right? The near west side and runaway values. And another narrative of Northeast Ohio is Lakewood and how extraordinarily successful and vibrant and thriving their markets are. What's interesting about this is if you look, you'll notice that downtown Cleveland and the immediate near west side are indeed sort of that high level, vibrant markets. But the difference between Lakewood and Cleveland's near west side is that whereas Lakewood has the entirety of its communities, if not in the B category, that shows a robust, very strong municipality. Cleveland very quickly starts to get into the edge territory. And we know this. We know that if you walk the streets in those areas, that there are transitions, there are blocks that are stronger than others where investment and renovation is happening. And so it tells just a slightly different story when you start to get closer into it. What it also lets us do is kind of reform how we think of the geographies. So instead of thinking of places like Ohio City or Clark Fulton or Stockyards, we can do something like this. And we can really kind of rearrange how our neighborhoods look from an economics lens. So all of a sudden now we only have about 4 or 5 neighborhoods. We've got our downtown and near west side strong corridor. We've got both, if you look to West Park and to Old Brooklyn, you see really that stable neighborhood on the edge. And then as you move closer toward the center of the west side of Cleveland, it starts to move into the more transitional and middle neighborhood areas, moving all the way into the D's and E's. That transition is critical. We started this presentation saying that we need to build from strength. So building from strength means finding areas where the housing market isn't E's or D's, but it also isn't necessarily the A's as you look on the near west side. It's places where we're seeing this transition. So this is by no means the scientific actual placement of middle neighborhoods, but it shows you that one could look at block groups and say, well, the potential for a targeted area, right, where we're going to do an investment is going to be along a corridor like Lorraine down in Bel Air Puritas, or on West 25th in Brooklyn Center, or Old Brooklyn on Pearl Road. And we're going to be able in those areas to look for where we target. So then we go deeper. Again, it's an exciting tool because we can show members of council, we can show members of the administration, we can show partners, even developers, an analysis that really, a level of analysis that we haven't really done before. So we've now moved over we're hovering over Old Brooklyn, just south of Brooklyn Center on Pearl. And we now see this transition point, right? The transition happens from the southeastern side as you move towards sort of the main street of Old Brooklyn. And right around here is where that's taking place. So we can zoom in further and using, again, the data we have always collected in Cleveland, this is just sales data, we can find homes that are selling in that stable, strong market. So the light green on the left represent home sales above 150,000. Then when we add in 100 to 150,000, the blue, you get a sense of which block groups and which census tracts are seeing the most investment. Similarly, we can look at the areas where the home values have stagnated, are now in the area where $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 homes typically are not showing market growth. And then we can show non-zero transfers, but distressed sales. And when we take these and we look at the maps, again, kind of collectively, we notice that there's a very clear transition point within this whole sector. And here it is. These are just 2 block groups, east and west sides of Broadview Road. And immediately you can see right around here where the transition is taking place. And when you overlay this with conversations on the ground, you'll see that while housing stock can change to the far east side, these are the same homes in this area. East and west of Broadview Road, you're gonna have the A-frames in the bungalows, the 3 bedrooms, the 2 baths. These are Cleveland homes that the only reason they're different is because the transition has occurred over time. And that is where we want to do an intervention. That is where we can stop that teetering on the edge and push it toward a functioning market. Just taking a walk down the street digitally today, you can see that in a distance where I could throw a baseball, we can hit sort of the next market up. And so when you notice this, what you can think of this as distress coming toward strength, or you can think of it as we have strength, let's build off of it. And that is really what we need to be doing. So here is that transition point. It is a very small, very bite-sized place. If you talk to the CDC, the 2 council representatives here, this is something that we can really theoretically talk. We don't have to talk about theoretically. We can talk about explicitly. There's a school, there's a park, there's a community garden, there's commercial properties, about 30 of them. When we talk about storefront renovation programs, when we talk about model blocks, we can be talking about not just what neighborhood is important, or not necessarily important, but what neighborhood is crucial for investment. We can talk about what quarter-mile length of street by doing this kind of analysis, which we are going to be able to do. Here's a tree canopy evaluation, same kind of information. If we only have 1,000 trees to plant in the fall, where are we going to plant them? There are a lot of different ways we can slice it, and I think it would make sense that we should be targeting wherever in the city we're placing them. So we can do this all over. Lee Harvard is another really strong example of a broad community that's middle class. A lot of the community is moving to Warrensville Heights, moving to Maple Heights. There's that aspirational change. So we need to find ways to really attract families and households to either stay or buy in Lee Harvard. Attraction is a really big component of this work. Here's the Bel Air Puritas Lorraine corridor around 130th, nestled right between West Park and the West Side. That's burgeoning. We have an area where home values, you can see here on this map, are actually relatively weak compared to other parts of the West Side. But the commercial corridor is actually very vibrant. It's connecting, obviously, 2 very vibrant parts of our city on the West Side. And so this is really another way of looking at how we target these communities. So then once we've identified the places, and again, the work we're going to be finishing up this summer will be able to give council and really anyone a view of maybe a half dozen of these nodes that we think are the premier targets for a middle neighborhood policy investments. So what do those kinds of things look like? Well, again, the dividends of this process is that we're going to be able to show every single block group in the entire county. And obviously we'll then be able to look at everywhere from Mount Pleasant to Glenville to Collinwood to Slavic Village and get understandings of not just the neighborhood, but really within those neighborhoods, are there places where we should be doing asset promotion? Are there places that actually are functioning at a level where we should be promoting strength? Or are they in that transition and we need to work on more intervention policies? So this is just one example of what can be done by policymakers using this information, this tool. Here is an example of 8 different policies: demolition of properties, tax abatement, land assembly for development. And looking at A through E, this particular typology, what it allows us to do is say all these places need to be worked on in different cycles, but we can't take the same approach to each place. So for example, if you look at a construction subsidy or a tax abatement, the market isn't functioning in that middle and on the places that are adjacent to it. On the strong markets, the market can withstand being fully market rate. They don't need construction subsidies to build new townhomes in Detroit Shoreway. And then where the market is weakest, of course, those subsidies won't go far enough. So the sweet spot is sort of right in the middle. And if we're evaluating all of our policy interventions by looking at ways that they fit the place we're trying to do them, if we add a geographic lens to all of the work that we're doing, or some of it, then we can start to really monitor and follow the interventions in the communities. And over time, using this tool, which would be updated each year, we should be able to see over like a 5-year period how they're working. Did tree canopy planting, storefront renovation, targeted allocations, and a model block move the market differently than, say, just a few blocks away from it? Here's just an example of how that's been done by another city. This is Philadelphia, and the purple and blue block groups on the south part of the map are really their strongest areas. This is from 2000 to 2006. And what they decided was that they wanted to subsidize development. They wanted to use the tax abatement program to seed development in an area that was relatively strong. You can see the yellow and the orange are sort of on the weaker part, but nearby. And this was just a targeted approach. It could have been done any number of ways. But again, using a geographic lens and really sort of saying, how do we grow the success? How do we take these thousands and thousands and thousands of households that are in these sort of transitional neighborhoods and find a way to make sure that they, instead of consistently selling for $45,000 or $55,000 or $60,000, that they are invested in, that they have value for the homeowners, that they provide value for the investors who want to make these places strong quality rentals. We need to incentivize that. Here's another example of how policy can be affected by this tool. Housing NOLA was a housing study done. This was in 2016. Just like we're about to approach, as the director mentioned, we're right on the cusp of starting our 10-year study, and it really comes at the right time. Their 70 neighborhoods were divided up by 5 typologies, and they were looking at the obsolescence of their housing stock. Where had it been modernized? Where was it lagging? And where did they want to make efforts to modernize or to expand what they had to offer the market? They then also had a market value study done. And when you layer these two together, you're given this opportunity. So instead of starting with just the housing study and saying, well, we should work where there are limited updates. As you can see here, within limited updates, there's about 120 block groups. But when you layer on top of that the economic study, you can slice those 120 block groups into the strongest markets, the middle markets, the lower markets. And if you're sitting at council and saying, where do we want to invest this new program that's going to help us build more doubles and quads so we can modernize the area and really take on the density we're looking for, if that's your goal, you're going to want to go into those middle areas because the market will take over in those purples. But in those blues and yellows, that's where it allows you to get a sort of a 3-dimensional way of doing policy. So within middle neighborhoods, one of our chief challenges is just investment. They are places that are close to a functioning market. They're close to the actual commercial corridor, seeing new investment by small businesses. And if you look at these places throughout the city of Cleveland, you'll see they're starting to get the new coffee shop, and they will see homes being renovated. And there's obviously a lot of long-term homeowners and small businesses that are sticking around. But the work to do that is very difficult. And we need to make it just a little bit easier with our ability to leverage the private sector with public subsidy. So things like high loan-to-value loans. This is a tool that has been used in Detroit. It's been used in Baltimore. We have versions of this in the Cleveland market, but developing a version of this that really says, if you buy a home in these middle markets, then you can access 125% of the value of that property, which really immediately can help us eliminate the appraisal gap that we see in these communities, which are simultaneously related to the long stagnation of values and also to the history of redlining, which has made a lot of these communities 10, 15, 25% lower than identical homes in other parts of the city. So we need to overcome those with policy. Tax abatement works the same way as a subsidy. Construction gap, with a construction gap financing program that we've just sort of started a couple of months ago in the community development area. We're working hand in hand with developers to see if we can get some of these homes in these middle markets where there's a gap invested in. And then we need to find additional ways to use the resources we have. So model block and storefront renovation out of community development. These are really targeted approaches. They make sense. And if we can layer them on to these areas, then we can really see dividends from that. And last but not least, one of the hardest things to do is talk about code enforcement and public services. Obviously the fire department doesn't come faster to different parts of our city. We don't pick up trash differently. It's a universal public good. But we do need to find ways to make sure that in these neighborhoods where we have that teetering element, we are doing everything we can to push them forward. So this is things like marketing and branding. We have in Cleveland, Live Cleveland, which is sort of a Cleveland live in our city brand and promotional tool. really investing in that effort to take the places that, since coming back home to Cleveland and working in the neighborhoods, I've heard far too many times that this is a diamond in the rough, right? Or it's a gem, but no one knows about it all over the city. Those are things that we need to stop saying and talking about. And instead, we need to make sure that it is known. And that means working with our real estate partners, working with our communication channels, finding better ways to get the secret, which shouldn't be a secret in the first place, out, that Cleveland has some incredible places to live and incredibly safe, quality education options, all of the things that families are looking for. We need to overcome the other gap, which is the information gap. And so through marketing and branding, through financial investment tools and subsidy, we can hopefully bridge that little space between where the private sector works and the public sector has to intervene and make our middle neighborhood stronger. So that's my presentation, and I'd love to open it up for some questions.
You didn't talk fast enough, Jason. Sorry. We don't have enough time now. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I've seen a lot of this information already, and certainly have participated at a number of sessions and forums. I know we have, I think the On the Edge book that Tanya and Director Manez talked about, and the publications done by Alan Malik, Professor Malik, really speak to where we're going and the issues that we're facing. Just a couple of quick questions. When you talked about the sales and we're showing the previous slides around median sales prices, were you talking about arm's length transactions, or were you talking about all sales? How are you identifying that within those charts?
That's right. So just arm's length transactions. And it was the final quarter of 2019, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then when you talked about, as we talked about interventions, you talked about some construction gap financing. Can you speak a little bit on how we're approaching, since many of these middle neighborhoods don't have, as you mentioned earlier, aren't CDBG eligible and don't have access to that pool of resources? What are some of the resources that are available when you start talking about filling some of those gaps?
Yeah. So with regard to the construction gap subsidy, our hope is that we can actually use the current funding to do a lot of these initial projects and really report back the success. I should point out that one of the elements of the construction gap, when we put out the notice, was that we didn't want to do more than about 5 homes at max in any one little area. And the reason is because the theory goes that the comps, the appraisal values are really the problem, not the quality or even the interest of developers. And so if we have homes that are consistently selling for $85 a square foot, so around $68,000, $70,000 in, let's say, Bel Air Puritas, then if we can get a couple of them fully renovated, and you can see here, this is a small gap of 10,000, but if with the rehab and we want to be selling them for 120, 135, if that's not going to happen on the first 1 or 2, by the 3rd or 4th, we envision that the comps will bear out. That is especially true with new construction, because new construction very quickly will, sometimes it's the first new construction in decades. So in terms of funding, this is part of that first runaway concept, which is that little bits of investment now hopefully make the market do the investment themselves. And again, in these communities where there's tens of thousands of households all over, A-frames everywhere, there's a lot of housing that can take this investment before we have any concerns about displacement pressure. Other elements are, there's CDBG, but we can actually use the low mod census tract regulation to do investment in a lot of these places, because as I mentioned in those maps with the chart, unfortunately, Cleveland's middle is not the middle, right? Cleveland's middle for housing values and for incomes are actually below the 80th percentile of AMI and below the 80th percentile of the median housing value of our county. And so because of that, they're actually in many cases eligible. And where they are ineligible, we can still do things like a storefront renovation program by the individual, model block programs by the average of the area. And then other tools mentioned here. So these are some of the organizations nationwide that have these high LTV loans. So the model is simple. Don't put income restrictions on it. So a family with 125% AMI in Cleveland is very much a working class, middle class family. And for them to be buying a home that's $140,000, $150,000 is really sort of the appropriate size home, size mortgage for them. But if all they can find are homes that are in significant need for extra repair, we want to be able to provide them with the tool without there being any penalties like PMI, in order to allow them to get a home, not be penalized at the appropriate rate, and get a higher loan. And with that, they can do investments. So we, like I mentioned, we've had some examples of this, the county help loan, the home heritage loan. It's really about cutting all of the red tape out and making these very basic products. And the last thing I'll say about that is one of the ways that other cities have gotten this done is the geographic tool that I started by showing really is a compelling argument that shows that these are neighborhoods that actually have a lot more strength than the banks necessarily understand. And so when it comes to underwriting these loans, we need to prove the case that Cleveland has value in the communities.
Great, thank you. Councilman Blaine Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of questions and a couple of comments. First of all, it's very good report, and hopefully we can get a copy of this because I would like to go back over it and do my due diligence again. One of the things that I did notice on the report is that I didn't see Fairfax and I didn't see Little Italy. I know that we're looking at this from a citywide perspective, but the reason I bring that up is because those two neighborhoods live adjacent to rather large institutions. And how did you factor that into how you establish a middle neighborhood, because they live next to very large employers? And we know the Richie Paparian study talked about how there's a need for an increase in housing because that's where the most job creation is taking place outside of the CBD, the downtown business district. So the first question I have is, and then on the flip side, Kinsman wasn't mentioned, which, that East 93rd Street corridor, which doesn't have an anchor institution, which I think, in my opinion, makes it a little difficult to try to invest in and try to find investors that are willing to do that. So how did you factor that into your middle neighborhoods report?
Thank you, Councilman. So first to the Fairfax and Little Italy question. One of the things that Richie's study was really looking at, like you mentioned, were these anchor institutions and places of jobs, calling them sort of emerging markets. That is, if we had sort of a list of types of places, communities that are adjacent to massive workforce opportunities, similar to the steel mills and places like Slavic Village and Old Brooklyn of the past, they have, just like we've said, you can't take the same approach to all these places. They have their own unique sort of policies that can be useful. So obviously down payment assistance, building a lot of workforce housing in these areas, relevant to the needs of the particular area. So Glenville obviously benefiting from University Circle employment creates a high need for some higher income housing. So when it comes to Little Italy or Fairfax, those are one category, similar to, I would say, the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative neighborhoods are also categories that are really relying on their adjacent assets. The thing about the middle neighborhoods is really you wouldn't think of them. That's actually what makes them so critical to think about, because they don't have necessarily an obvious job corridor. They were built really as the first suburbs of the city. They were built Lee Harvard, North Collinwood, right? These were places where families would buy their first home, be far enough away from some of the more chaotic parts of the city, I suppose. And those bedroom communities really were the first wave of expansion. And so their challenges are unique to places like those that are emerging adjacent to employers. They all have their challenges, but these are places where the biggest challenge is their stability means we can push them forward, but we don't have anything to hang on to. And then with regard to the Kinsman and the East 93rd corridor, and I apologize, I will embed this presentation and also a link to some of these maps. Like I mentioned, the whole county is covered, but if you were to look at the east side of Cleveland, and I'll quickly kind of take us to the map of the zoomed in map of the near west side, it would, you would see similar similar economic realities and typologies for the different places. And the point being, imagine Kinsman on this map. The data will show us what's underlying, but then it's up to us for our understandings of the area. So if it's near a hospital, if it has a school that we're considering closing or opening, if there's a large, public park in the space that the metro parks are thinking of taking over, whatever the asset mapping of that geography, this lets us see how robust is that community in the first place. Should we be thinking about these big ticket items, or should we be thinking about stabilization efforts? So all of the places in Cleveland are available. If any of you are interested, I will be able to send the whole map over right after this.
The other question that I have is, when we're looking at displacement, you mentioned some of that in your conversation. We also want to be very careful in some of these areas that we don't start pricing people out and then people get pushed out. How does your strategy really try to address that, to really try to make sure that we have that balance of affordable housing units as well as market rate housing units? How do you balance that out a little bit?
So,
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, Councilman, I was just going to interject there a little bit, and then I have a feeling I know what Jason was going to say as well, is that, next week we'll be sharing with council the results of our tax abatement study.
Okay, great.
And what you really see there is, while there are about 2% of our city, about 13 block groups, have real displacement pressure, significant pressure right now, the vast majority of our city is not experiencing that. It is critically important that we address the displacement issues in those neighborhoods, as you said, ensuring that people who have lived in those neighborhoods for their whole lifetime or for generations are able to manage increases in taxes or increases in rents. On the flip side, what you see here is really the vast majority of Cleveland where, and I don't need to tell you this, of course, we have neighborhoods that have lost such significant value that our strategy really needs to be about how do we reinvest in those neighborhoods. That's really the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, right? Is that really strong intervention in neighborhoods to start bringing them back where there are assets. What's exciting about this kind of middle neighborhoods view is these are neighborhoods that don't need as significant of an intervention and really will likely, and this is a good thing, right? Will likely never move to that stage. It's like, it's kind of what Jason was talking about, that there are neighborhoods in every city that are hot, that are challenged in terms of that diverse level of housing stock, but sort of our first suburb kind of neighborhoods in Cleveland, and our neighborhoods that really have been mostly residential, maybe have a small commercial corridor area, or a little more significance like a Collinwood. These are the places where stability can be really important, because it's really where you're going to have that middle class, those middle class values without too much of a concern of them having the assets, frankly, to skyrocket in the way that Fairfax could or Huff could, because of the adjacency to a strong institution. So Jason, I'm sorry, I should have just probably let you address that.
No, thank you, Director. What I was going to bring up is one other thing, which is, because we're not a growing region, as we know, which is its own challenge for us. The reason why, and the Director mentioned this, the reason why some of our places really have captured the narrative of gentrification and the concerns of displacement is because, while it's true in some parts of the narrative that that's happening, again, these are just a few parts of our city that are extremely attractive to just about everyone. If you want to live, if you're in the region of Northeast Ohio and you want to live in a walkable, vibrant neighborhood, and you perhaps want to be able to walk or ride your bike to an Indians game, you're not going to be able to really do that anywhere but the immediate near West Side or downtown. So they have an attraction point for everyone, which is causing some pressure. But one of the really interesting things about middle neighborhoods, and again, the definition is open. So we have a lot of places. I've mentioned Lee Harvard, I've mentioned Collinwood, but there's lots of parts of our city that look like this. They have something called naturally occurring affordable housing. So right now, I'm working with CSU and Cleveland Neighborhood Progress on an application to the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation to study Cleveland's middle neighborhoods from the perspective of income equity. So if you're a lower or moderate income family and you're living in a middle neighborhood versus living in a lower income neighborhood, how do your social indicators, how do your health indicators, how do your quality of life indicators pan out over time? And that's something that we're going to be studying, because the theory is these are places that can absorb investment. So here's a very specific example, a family of 4 in the old Brooklyn community. This is real data from 2017. If you use the basic underwriting criteria and you look at some typical debts of a family right now, where you've got car payments, you'll see that on average, again, using the area's median, the loan amount that can be afforded with a credit score of around 600 is 135. What that's saying to us is that the individuals, the incomes in these areas already can afford a higher price point of home than what the homes are selling at. And the reason is, you might think it's a bargain, but when you buy homes that are $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, there's a really great paper written by the director of planning at Akron, which was called the house is too damn cheap. And it was a play off of that political candidate, but the idea being that homes need to have some value. And we've hit a point where they're too low. And so not everyone necessarily can afford this, but if this is your median range, and yet the median sales in that area is $72,000, then we have some breathing room to get investors in, to get home buyers in, to see new kitchens, to see new roofs and new garages that are much needed before we could ever begin a conversation around displacement. It's always important, but I believe equitable development will actually come from creating mixed income communities like middle neighborhoods, and probably are not as easy in higher end communities where we're trying to force it to happen.
Last question, Mr. Chair, is have we correlated any of this data with what the banks are doing around redlining? Because I still, from what I understand and looking at some of the reports that Frank Ford has done and other people have done, show that we still have a problem with banks lending in this city. Whether that's having products that can help people do renovations to their home or build new homes or whatever. And have we made any correlations to data to show how redlining can potentially still lend to the deterioration of some of these middle neighborhoods? And that's all I have, Mr. Chair. Question?
No.
So I'll, to the councilman through the chair, I'll address that and Jason can follow up. I mean, really, this tool, this data is exactly what we now want to take out to the banks. We were going to do this presentation initially to all of you, I think the last week of March. And at that point, we were really working with our banking partners to share with them what Baltimore has done to date, where, and I'm going to say it wrong, so I'm going to hand this to Jason in a second, because I'll get the numbers of banks that have pooled funds and have had several cycles of lending to do the kind of products that we need in Cleveland, right? In order to take that $60,000 or $40,000 home and bring it up to being 80 or 120, you need an acquisition rehab product. You really need to help show our banking partners that in even some of our neighborhoods that are just starting to come back, I think that's one of the most interesting things Jason's seen with this tool section, that could be considered middle, right? There are a few block groups that could use that intervention, whether you're in Slavic Village or in Fairfax or in Lee Harvard. So as we call them middle neighborhoods, it's a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because the whole neighborhood isn't really middle for the most part. See, Jason, I've been listening. But we really have to show the banks that in areas where they haven't been lending, again, in almost every neighborhood, there's an argument to in certain places, and here's how we can do it, and here's how we can pool your risk by having you be part of a pool that then a nonprofit partner would do the lending, a little bit like we're doing with our Let's Save Home Fund, honestly. And if I could just let Jason speak to that for 2 minutes, because I didn't provide the details on Baltimore, and I think it's really helpful because it's a test case that we can take to our banks.
Thank you, Director. Yes, Baltimore really is at the forefront of this work. They began at the beginning of 2001, actually, with the Baltimore Community Foundation and the Gold Secker Foundation, sort of commissioning a report to look at the neighborhoods of Baltimore. And that's really where actually a lot of this started. This is where the initial findings that there were places that weren't nearly in the distress that other parts of the city were seeing, but were just not moving. And when they started talking to the banks, talking to homeowners, talking to the local nonprofits, they started to understand the narrative as we now understand it. They've done 3 different loan pools since then. Over $130 million have been lent. And they have 3 products. They have a refinance, high LTV refinance mortgage, so that people can, in their communities, if you're in one of these communities, you're seeing investment happening, you're seeing the values are moving upward, you can go ahead and take that out and invest in your home. They have, of course, the acquisition rehab model for homeowners, and they have, similar to some of the help loans that we have, remodeling loans. And the idea for all 3 of them is that nothing about that is particularly unique, except that they are backed by the community foundation. And so there's a bit of a risk pool to it. Their delinquencies have been extremely small, but by backing it with the philanthropic organizations, what they've been able to do is take those bigger risks and say, we're going to go into the communities that are in the middle. These are not the areas that are obvious to banks, but this is a problem we have with our financial services community, is their understanding of our neighborhoods seldom reflects reality. And we have this history of redlining, which continues to echo in the values today. No one questions that. And so they were able to say, we're going to create a slightly riskier population of homes that we want to invest in, but we're going to say it doesn't have to be low mod. So it can be people with true moderate incomes. And in Cleveland, if you make $55,000 a year, you're not at 80% AMI, but you should be eligible to buy a nice workforce home or middle-class home in Cleveland. So it made it a large population of eligibility, extremely targeted areas, and it was purely an investment into the communities. Like I said at the beginning, the public sector can only do so much, but the homeowners, if we can incent them to get into these places, and many of them want to, they just can't find the homes with the right updates, then we can see an inflow of capital to these communities, which is really the most important thing we can see to stabilize values.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions from my colleagues? Thank you for your robust presentation today. I know there's a lot going on in this market and in this initiative. I know I just sent out a notice on a presentation that's coming up with Professor Alan Malik. If folks want to get in on that presentation, they can get a lot of wonderful information and get a better understanding on the kind of the legacy cities and Black neighborhoods that are facing changes in the middle neighborhoods. So take a look at that email that I just sent out, and it may be something you want to sit in on as well. With that, if there's no further questions, we will adjourn. Thank you very much, Director. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks.